Please welcome Jessica Mishna, appearing as Wisconsin First Lady, Cordelia Harvey.
Everyone can see me. I am never quite certain as to whether I am visible to everyone. For you see, I am what you might call a spirit, an apparition, a ghost. Why, some have even called me an angel. But I see myself as a messenger, and the message I bring to you today is just as important in your time as it was in mine during that great conflagration known as the American Civil War. My name is Mrs. Cordelia Harvey. My dear husband, Lewis Powell Harvey, had the honor, the great privilege of being the governor of the great state of Wisconsin during the American Civil War. I am not a native of Wisconsin. I was born in upstate New York, near Buffalo. My father, John Perrin, was a very successful and prosperous farmer. Upon my birth, I was christened Cordelia Adelaide Perrin. But you see, even though my father was doing very well in upstate New York, Papa had read about a faraway place called the Territory of Wisconsin. He read about the rolling, green, verdant farmland, the beautiful lakes and rivers. And so Papa decided that he would purchase land in this faraway territory. We settled in the southeastern corner of the state, which would eventually become the state of Wisconsin. A little community on the shores of Lake Michigan called Southport. I have been told, however, the name of that city has since been changed to Kenosha. My father again was very prosperous, and I would be trained as a schoolmistress. Upon the completion of my training, I was able to secure a teaching position at a small private school there in Southport. And it was there that I would meet the young, handsome, ambitious, intelligent headmaster, Mr. Lewis Powell Harvey. I do hope you will excuse my impertinence, but we fell in love. We married and settled in Southport. But you see, it was not appropriate at that time for a married woman to be teaching school. And so I was forced to surrender my position at the school. But my Lewis, he had such grand dreams and plans. He was satisfied in some respects to be a schoolmaster, but his dreams were so much greater. As I say, we settled into a lovely little house there in Southport. Our union would be blessed with one daughter, our little daughter, Mary. Sadly, when our little one was barely 2 years old, we lost her. Oh, Louis and I, we clung to one another. Such grief, but we also knew that we must go on. By that time, Louis had begun to invest in various projects, mills throughout southeastern and some in southwestern Wisconsin. And it seemed that everything that Louis turned his hand to turned into pure gold. And then he became interested in the political world. He held various minor positions and eventually moved up the ladder of politics in the new state of Wisconsin. He would become the Secretary of State, and eventually he would be elected as the governor of the state of Wisconsin. Shortly after his inauguration, our nation was indeed deep into that civil war, the bloodiest and most unkind war ever fought. And Louis, he hated to see our young men and boys marching off to war, but he wanted to do everything possible for these young men and boys. He approached the legislature that they might give additional funds to the boys who are marching off to war to purchase needed supplies, clothing, food, medicine. And he was successful. In April of 1862, a great battle would occur in a faraway place again, a place called Shiloh, Tennessee. Word had reached the governor and the legislature that our dear Wisconsin boys were in desperate need of food, clean, fresh clothing, and medicines. They were in very desperate straits. So Louis, with the help of about 90 very prominent businessmen in Wisconsin, began to organize this shipment of goods to our dear boys. Why? They purchased horses and wagons and flatboats, and all manner of goods would be taken to our dear fighting boys in Tennessee. Along the way down to that battle in Tennessee, the governor and the other men would stop at various Union camps, bringing food and clothing and medicine, but perhaps best of all, they would bring letters from home. The governor and his entourage continued down to Shiloh, Tennessee. Very late, one starless, moonless night, the governor and other gentlemen were transferring some of these large crates from one of the flatboats to another. You see, this had to be done in the dead of night, for there were still Confederate troops in the area. Governor Harvey slipped on the muddy bank and fell into the raging waters of the Tennessee River, spring, swollen waters, raging, thundering. There was a young physician aboard one of the flatboats. He extended his walking stick in an effort to save the governor. Another young physician by the name of Dr. James Clark of Racine, Wisconsin, tethered himself to the railing of the flatboat and dove into those dark, raging waters in an effort to save the governor. But it was of no use. My dear Louis had been swept beneath one of the flatboats. and was drowned. His body was not found for some 14 days, 65 miles downstream. Apparently, there were some children playing along the riverbank when they spied the body in the water. One of the children ran back to his father's farm, telling him of what he had seen in the water. This gentleman was a Mr. Covington. Mr. Covington sent one of his slaves down to the river. The slave waded into the water, removed the identification papers from the body, and returned to his master. When Mr. Covington realized the body in the river was that of the governor of the state of Wisconsin, he immediately rallied some of his neighbors. They took a wagon down to the river, rescuing the governor, bringing his remains back to Mr. Covington's farm. Mr. Covington then had the body prepared and stored in his ice house. He then notified some of the Wisconsin regiments in the area that they might retrieve the remains of Governor Harvey. I may point out that Mr. Covington did all of this at his own expense, and also that he was a Confederate sympathizer. The Wisconsin regiments retrieved the governor's body, bringing him back to the capital of Madison. He was given a state funeral and laid to rest in the Forest Home Cemetery. When I was told of what happened to my dear Lewis, my friends gathered round me, but I felt lost. I was rudderless. You see, I had no children to care for or remind me of my husband. I had nothing. It seemed as though my life had ended with the death of Lewis. One night, I walked along a riverbank, and I looked down into those dark waters, and I thought, perhaps I should simply share Lewis's fate. For I had nothing to keep me bound to this earth. I knew that Lewis would not allow me to have such thoughts, and my faith would not allow me to have such thoughts. I returned to my home. I lay upon that bed and wept all night long. But by morning, I had made a decision. You see, upon Lewis's election to the governorship, we had discussed the situation of all of those ordinary soldiers, the ordinary enlisted men, that they were not given proper care when they were sick or wounded, and shortages were always claimed by the hospitals who cared for our men. And we also discussed what would happen to these men when they returned from this war, for surely the war would end. And these men, many of them still wounded and sick from the ravages of the war, they would return to their families, but perhaps their families had died out during the war, or perhaps their families could no longer care for them. Many of the men might not be able to work, to care for themselves. What was to become of all these wounded men who gave so much to preserve the Union? We decided that we needed more hospitals and soldiers' homes to care for our boys. And as dawn broke that day, I realized that I must lay aside my mourning. I must lay aside the black clothing of mourning, and I must take up that cloak that my husband had laid down. I must become an advocate for these dear soldiers. Well, where do I start? I had become acquainted with a woman in Chicago, Mrs. Elijah Cook. Her husband was a very prominent and wealthy banker there in Chicago, and Mrs. Cook was in charge of the office in Chicago of the Western District Sanitary Commission. Now, may I point out that these sanitary commissions were not an arm of the government. They were set up totally by private citizens and funded by private citizens. Mrs. Cook even enlisted her husband's help. He was a fantastic administrator, and so she brought him in to reorganize the entire operation at the Chicago office of the Western District Sanitary Commission, that we might ship more and more supplies to our dear fighting boys in blue. Well, Mrs. Cook suggested that I would make an excellent hospital inspector. And so my career as a hospital inspector began. And I was no ordinary hospital inspector. Well, you see, many of these hospitals, I do not mean the field hospitals at the edge of a battlefield in which the men are cared for in those seriously grave moments of being wounded. No, I mean hospitals that were supposed to help our boys recover from their sicknesses, from their wounds. Many of these hospitals were a hospital in name only. They were tents with open sides, and there lay our boys on filthy, waste-soaked cots with the air blowing in on our boys and the floors. Why, they were populated by every sort of vermin. Sometimes they would put boards on the dirt floors, which only gave the vermin a more comfortable and suitable environment. No, I was no ordinary hospital inspector. I did not come marching in with my handkerchief over my nose saying, "You're doing a wonderful job, you're doing a wonderful job." No. I became notorious. I often would see in these hospitals row upon row of sick and wounded soldiers lying in filthy cots in their own waste. And those who would be the caregivers in these hospitals, no one else wanted them. They would often care for our soldiers. Oh, what a pretense. And they would often charge our soldiers for a drink of clean water. In some of these hospitals, I saw in the corners piles of refuse, 6 and 7 feet high, including severed limbs that had been disposed of. The stench of unwashed, sick bodies in these hospitals was unbelievable. As I walked through, the stench clung to every fiber of my clothing. And the food that our boys were being given was barely palatable. Rotted, rancid meat purchased by the army from war profiteers. And the bread these boys were given, the bakers were cutting the flour. 75% flour, 25% sawdust. And our boys were supposed to regain their health and vigor that they might return to the battlefield. On one occasion, as I walked through those narrow aisles, row upon row, I came upon a young boy, perhaps only 16 or 17 years of age. His face was heavily bandaged. He had been blinded in a cannon explosion. The bandages were filthy, blood-soaked, covered with maggots. And he lay upon that tiny cot. As I approached him, he called out in a thread-thin voice, "Mama? Is that you, Mama?" I took his hand as I replied, "Yes, my dear boy, it's Mama. I'm here to care for you. I'm here to look after you." The child stretched out a skeletal thin hand and clutched my skirt. And then he expired. This is what I would witness in these hospitals. On one occasion, I came upon a young surgeon squatting on the bare ground outside of one of the hospitals. His trousers were soaked all the way to his knees in blood. His shirt was covered. His face lined and haggard, betraying his young years. He sat upon the ground, and I sat down next to him, and he was weeping. I turned to the young man and I asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" He turned to me, and his response, "I just can't save them all. I just can't save them all." During my times of visiting the hospitals, I began to keep records. These ledgers. I kept these ledgers, and within these ledgers, every young man I met in my hospital inspections, I wrote down his name, his rank, his regiment, sometimes his hometown, and also the nature of his wounds or illnesses. And sadly, sometimes I would record the day of his death. And I thought, perhaps, if I were to go to the very top generals within the Union Army, that I might lay out my plans to have suitable hospitals built in the north, so that we could bring these sick and wounded boys north, that they might recover and be able to take their place upon the firing line. And I thought, well, I must go to the very top. And so I decided that I would visit with General Grant. I traveled all the way to Vicksburg, Mississippi, to meet with the general. I explained my plan about having these hospitals built in the north, not only to care for the boys during the war, which was so essential, but that these hospitals and homes could care for those soldiers after the war. Well, the general listened very, very politely. He chomped on his cigar and said, "It won't work. The minute we send these boys north, they will desert. And besides, I can't be carrying on and worrying about the sick and the wounded. I can scarcely get enough men to put healthy ones on the firing line. This plan just won't work." Well, I would not be beaten. Unfortunately, while I was down in the swampy environs of Vicksburg, Mississippi, I acquired malaria and became very ill. But you see, I had the privilege of returning to Wisconsin, to the clean, vigorous air of the North. And while I was there recovering, I began to think about who would really help me. Who would send the supplies that my boys needed so desperately? The answer to my question was very simple. The good citizens of the state of Wisconsin. They are the most generous on earth. And so I sent that call out to them. And each and every citizen in this state responded to that. They would send everything that our boys needed. We had strawberries and cherries and apples everywhere from Door County to Delavan. And we had berries and clothing. Oh, how the ladies would knit and crochet stockings and warm mittens for our boys, for it will not always be summer. The boys must have warm clothing for the winter. And oh, the ladies began to preserve wonderful fruits for the boys. Oh, and from the German communities of Milwaukee, Fristadt, and Green Bay, we received barrel upon barrel of sauerkraut. Sauerkraut, you say? Well, it travels well. But beyond its traveling capacity, the physicians had noticed that sauerkraut alleviates the symptoms of a very serious disease called scurvy, a disease in which the hair falls out, the teeth fall out, blindness will ensue, and eventually death. But sauerkraut would alleviate these symptoms. And so it was from all over the state of Wisconsin we received supplies. And the ladies, the dear ladies, as I say, they would put up these wonderful sweet fruits to send off to the boys. But oftentimes, our young men would ask for something somewhat more bracing. And so the ladies began to include in all of these crates a bottle of whiskey or brandy. But strangely enough, the whiskey or brandy rarely made it to its destination. The ladies would not be beaten. They began to put the whiskey and brandy in the sweet fruits that they sent for the dear boys. And so the boys received their sweet treats and their whiskey and brandy. It indeed was because of the good citizens of the state of Wisconsin. And the ladies in their social circles, in their churches, they would raise money by holding sanitary fairs in which they would sell, mittens and gloves and stockings and hats and household artifacts that they could save that money and be able to purchase a medicine box such as the one I am holding. These were manufactured in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Chicago. They contained all the medicine that a physician or nurse might need day to day to care for a patient. And they were small and convenient enough that one could carry them on foot or even on horseback. And it was all due to the good ladies and their industrious sanitary fairs. Well, at one point in time, I still realized that I was no closer to having those hospitals built, and I must do something. And then I began to have a sense of homesickness. I was homesick to see friends and relatives in upstate New York. And so I decided I would continue my recuperation near friends and relatives in New York. And as I rested and regained my health, I thought more and more deeply about my hospitals. And I thought, I must go to the very top. I must be able to speak directly to the President of the United States. And so I began writing letters. I wrote letter after letter to Mr. Lincoln, outlining my plans and asking for an audience. It seemed as though my prayers and my letters would go unanswered. But then finally, Finally, I received a letter from Mr. Hay. He was one of Mr. Lincoln's secretaries. And in this letter, the gentleman wrote, if I could be in Washington City on such and such a day, at such and such a time, he could guarantee a private audience with the president himself. Oh, I would be there. And oh, that night before I was to meet with the president, I paced and paced and paced my hotel room, and I practiced intensely, rehearsing every single detail of what I would say to the president. That morning, I dressed very carefully. And you see, I would show the president all of my ledgers. And I would tell him what I had seen in those hospitals. And I would explain in detail the plan for my hospitals. Oh, I left my hotel and began the walk to the president's house. I passed people along the way. Some men, women, and even children sitting alongside the road, weeping. I saw women, men dashing from one stranger to the next, inquiring and shaking a piece of paper at them, inquiring for the whereabouts of a beloved father, husband, brother, son, friend. I looked around and I realized that all of Washington was in mourning. I approached the president's house. I was escorted up a flight of stairs. And there, I stood at the door of the president's office. Oh, I could scarcely breathe. I wish I had not tightened myself so. I finally knocked at the door. There was a long pause, and then a rather high-pitched voice answered from within. Who is it? I replied, it's Mrs. Harvey of Wisconsin. There was another long pause, and then the voice replied, come in. I came into the room. Mr. Lincoln was seated at his desk. He did not rise when I came into the room. He was in his shirt sleeves. I noticed that the sleeve of his right hand was covered in ink, as were his fingers. He wore little spectacles pushed down on his nose. His desk was cluttered with paper, and behind him there was a window, and beneath the window there was a small table, and that too was cluttered with papers. And as I approached, the president looked up at me over those little spectacles, and he said, huh, so you're the Mrs. Harvey I've heard so much about, eh? I replied, yes, sir, that's the Mrs. Harvey. And then what occurred next, I cannot explain to you. I rushed around the desk, and I took my ledgers, and I shook them under the president's nose, and I began shrieking at him and shouting. And then he spread out his spidery hands on the desk, pushed himself up. He turned to that little table under the window and clutched a handful of papers, and he began shaking them under my nose. and he shouted at me, "My dear woman, I do not need you to come in here to tell me about the casualties, the numbers. I have the numbers every day from the War Department. I don't need you to come in and tell me those numbers. Good day, madam." Oh, I realized perhaps I had destroyed any chance of ever having my hospitals. I backed out of the room that day. I was afraid to turn my back to him. And there I stood in the doorway. And I could feel the tears were welling up in my eyes. And then I said, "Oh, my dear Mr. President, I did not mean to add a featherweight to your already overburdened shoulders. I wish I had stayed at home." He looked at me over those little spectacles and replied, "I wish you'd stayed at home too." Oh, as I left the president's house that day, I thought I had indeed destroyed everything. But as the months would pass, I would meet 4 more times with the president. We had become friends of sort. I reminded him that my dear late husband, the governor, had supported Mr. Lincoln in his senatorial race in 1858. And furthermore, in 1860, he had supported the president. So, perhaps I had something to trade. That last visit with him was in February of 1865. We chatted, as friends do, about all of the gossip, for there is always plenty of gossip in Washington City. And then the president called me over to his desk. He sat down at the desk. Opening a drawer, he took out a clean piece of paper, laid it before him, and he picked up his pen. He looked up at me and said, "Mrs. Harvey, you shall have your hospitals. You shall have one hospital in the capital of Madison, one hospital on the shores of Lake Michigan in Milwaukee, and one hospital on the banks of the Mississippi River in Prairie du Chien." And he proceeded to write out the executive order for my 3 hospitals. As I left that day, we chatted, standing there in the hallway, saying our farewells. He looked down at me and he smiled broadly. He said, "You know, you remind me of a little lady who lives upstairs. She doesn't stop until she gets what she wants." And then he went on, "I heard Mr. Seward said he asked you how long you were going to stay here in Washington City, and your reply was, 'As long as it takes to get my hospitals.' You were true to your word, lady." As I walked away from him that day, he called to me, "Mrs. Harvey, you think I'm extraordinarily handsome, don't you?" I replied, "Yes, Mr. President, I think you are amazingly handsome." Little did I know that would be the last time I would see our dear father Abraham alive. For in April of that year, he would be cruelly taken from us with an assassin's bullet. But I had achieved that goal. I returned to Madison and I became the administrator at the hospital there. We eventually were able to open an orphanage there to house those poor children who had been abandoned due to that cruel war. Governor Falwell had given over his home as a temporary hospital, but we would build a new and finer hospital and home for our dear soldiers. But again, I felt that pull, the pull to return for a time to New York State and see family and renew old friendships. I settled in a small town and I became very active in the Methodist Church there. And I was so pleased that I was again able to teach the little ones. That has always been my greatest joy, is to be with little children. And every Sunday, I would be teaching the little ones. I became a very dear friend with my pastor, Reverend Albert Chester. He was a widower with 3 grown daughters. We would marry. It was a marriage of respect and companionship, and I became the pastor's wife. And oh, my duties were endless. Church picnics and church suppers and flowers for the altar and on and on and on. And I reveled in every moment. But sadly, my dear Albert would leave me too. He was laid to rest next to his dear first wife and one of his daughters. And I would receive so many letters from my dear sister Mary, who lived in Verona, Wisconsin. She kept begging me and begging that I come back to Wisconsin. She pointed out that I still had my house in Clinton and could certainly be comfortable there. And she was lonely for my company. And so I decided to come back to Wisconsin and settled into my home in Clinton, and again became very, very busy in the church. Being with the children, always my greatest joy. But I was growing older and somewhat tired. I recall that it was in February. It was an unusually warm day in February in Wisconsin. Blue sky and gentle breeze, but very, very warm. I was visiting my sister Mary that Sunday. I had come to stay for a few days and went out onto the porch to enjoy the beautiful weather. And that was when the end of my life came, in my 74th year. It was not painful or difficult. It was as though a cloud or a shadow had passed over. The doctor would tell my dear sister that I had succumbed to a stroke. I was laid to rest next to my dear husband, Louis Paul Harvey, and very near my little daughter, Mary, to be reunited after all those years. But you see, I saw a task before me, and I set a goal for myself. And I was able to achieve that goal. The care of my dear soldiers. I had set out to accomplish that. And indeed, I had succeeded. However, I am always reminded of those words, Mr. Lincoln's second inaugural address. We must care for those who have borne the battle. We must care for his widow and orphans. And I accomplished my task. But as long as there is one soldier in need of help, in need of comfort, in need of care, that task will never be complete. And I leave that task up to you. Thank you. Thank you so kindly. Thank you. Very shortly, I don't know how my time is looking. Oh, it's 8 o'clock. It is 8 o'clock. We have a few minutes. Very quickly, are there any questions that I might answer for you? Wasn't she a real spitfire? Can you imagine walking into President Lincoln's office and saying, okay, mister, this is what I want. Just sign the paper and I'll be on my way.
So she's buried at Forest Hills?
Right, she's with the governor. He's got the big thing. She's got a little. Yes, he only served 73 days. 73 days. But you know what's really funny about that? What could be funny about that? If you look in a book of Wisconsin Who's Who, and you look at Governor Harvey, Louis Paul Harvey, he served as governor 73 days. He gets almost 3 pages. Mrs. Harvey, who began what we now call the Veterans Administration and the Veterans Hospital System, she gets a line that says, Cordelia Ann Lavery Harvey, born down by New York, blah, 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 wife of the governor of Wisconsin. Amen. Yeah, so did she have to have her story told? You bet she did. But you can imagine, and we have to just turn the clock back in our heads and realize what it was like for a woman of that time period to go alone, to travel from place to place, which she did with her case. And she had that little gray bonnet on, and nothing made her happier and more alive than when she approached the entrance to the hospital, and when these sick and wounded men would push themselves up on their elbow and they'd call out, "She's here! The angel in the gray bonnet is here." And she did it. She went from place to place, and she did indeed stay in Washington City until she got what she wanted. Thank you.
Was the start of the Veterans Administration.
Pardon?
Did your efforts lead to
It would lead eventually.
Start of the Veterans Administration?
I'm sorry, I didn't realize I did that. The lady asked if it was the beginning of the Veterans Administration. Yes, indeed it was. It was a foundation that was laid. It would take a long time to establish, but she had laid that foundation.